We're going to just spend a few minutes, 10 or 15 minutes, going through a lot of material, and I'm going to ask Charlie to come out so that can talk about that. But each of these topics, now this is available, again, ACLU.org, Know Your Rights, and this is the one on protests and demonstrations. You can look at this, you can go into it in detail, but let's just touch on any of them. First question, can my free speech be restricted because of what I say, even if it's controversial?
Yes? No, of course not.
Okay.
Right?
No, content-based restrictions are generally considered unconstitutional. Where can I engage in free speech activity? Generally, anything that's considered what lawyers and courts call a public forum, or which is a place like streets, sidewalks, parks, gathering places where generally the public is traditionally allowed to go. Plazas in front of public buildings and so forth. Private property, generally, no, you don't have, your right to protest doesn't include a right to invade someone's private property. Do I need a permit before I engage in free speech activity? Charlie, do you want to say something about permits?
Sure. Well, we could probably spend an entire evening talking about permits, particularly most jurisdictions in Virginia do require some sort of permit within their ordinances. If it's, they vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but basically if you're going to obstruct the street or potentially block traffic on a sidewalk, or if you want to, say, have control over a park or a public forum, generally the ACLU is opposed to permits. It's basically asking permission to exercise your free speech rights, but one benefit is if you're going to be in a public space and you're going to get a permit, that allows you to control that space. So that, say, you know, students here wanted to go out and demonstrate in front of somewhere, if they get the permit, then any counter-protesters that show up, the police are legally obligated to keep them back if there's a permit. So if you have the permit, you're allowed, that's your space, you get to control it, and they have to keep counter-protesters back. If you just do a spontaneous demonstration on the sidewalk and counter-protesters are there sort of shouting you down or blocking you, or, you know, it can cause problems, that sort of thing. But if you have any other detailed questions about permits, come see me afterwards.
If you haven't obtained a permit, yes, spontaneous demonstration can occur, but if it's planned, if it involves a lot of people, if it involves disruption to ordinary activities of others who aren't protesting, then you may be required to get a permit in advance. It actually makes sense, not necessarily that you should have to get a permit, but that there should be a way for order to be maintained so you're not impeding traffic or interfering with other people's rights of egress and ingress. May I distribute leaflets and other literature? Yes, absolutely. Again, as long as you're not obstructing people's passage somewhere or interfering with other people's business, you have every right to pass out literature. Do I have a right to picket on public sidewalks? Yes. Picketing is a whole set of laws unto itself. It's often related to labor or employment protests, but it could be any kind of a protest. But generally, the picketing involves the same kind of issues as any other protest or demonstration. What do you do if you get stopped by the police? Well, that was the first part. That was Know Your Rights 101. And we go back to that and go back to some of the really good things that the panelists on immigration talked about, special considerations. And if I'm under arrest, The way to find out if you're under arrest, because they don't necessarily tell you, is to ask, am I free to go? And if you're not free to go, you're, in a sense, under arrest or at least restrained so that you have Fourth Amendment rights, and your lawyer could later argue that the police didn't have justification for exercising that kind of restraint on you. Can you be searched? It depends on the circumstances. You can't just be searched willy-nilly for no reason at all. If a policeman thinks that you might be armed or dangerous or involved in some unlawful activity, they may be able to do a limited pat-down of your outer clothing to determine whether you might have a weapon or something dangerous. But they can't search your possessions. They can't order you to empty your pockets or things like that. And they certainly can't seize your property, including your cell phone or your camera. What do you do if your rights have been violated? The most important thing you've already heard in terms of the app, use that or something like it. If you don't have an app or a recording, or someone nearby has a recording, sit down as soon after the event as possible with anyone who also might have knowledge, talk about what happened, and as specifically and quickly as possible and thoroughly as possible, describe everything that went on, exactly what was said, what was done, what the sequence was. That later on may allow you or your lawyer to assert your rights in a way that may be effective, either in a disciplinary action against a police officer, or even if there are serious consequences or harms involved in some kind of a lawsuit. Photographing or videotaping, we've already touched on, and the answer is you absolutely do have that right. Can the government impose a financial charge to exercise free speech rights? Charlie, do you want to take that?
This one's terrible.
I give Charlie all the hard
Sorry,
ones.
I know. Unfortunately, we challenged this a few years ago, and the Virginia courts have said they can impose reasonable fees on a permit, and by reasonable, the court did not actually specify what reasonable is. I will say that if any students here or anyone's planning to go to protest or needs additional information, they can contact us and we can walk them through the process. But basically, it boils down to they can charge. If you're going to have a parade or a march or a demonstration, they can charge you for an escort, a police escort, basically, or police to block the roadway. What we're seeing, unfortunately, is that if your protest happens to be controversial, right, then some jurisdictions are saying, well, you're going to need 80 police officers. You're going to need 40. We're going to need police officers in order to keep counter-protesters back. And that is not appropriate. They can't charge you more just because your speech is controversial. So if the KKK wants to come and protest and do a march or whatever they do, they can't be charged more because they know that probably several thousand counter-protesters will show up. That's part of the police's job, to keep people safe. But generally, they can charge you for the individual police officers or the escort, so to speak.
If you have a question about that, contact a lawyer or contact an organization like the ACLU if you're having problems like that. Let's go to number 15. Do counter demonstrators have free speech rights? Yes, they do. And we encourage you to respect them. However, the police have an obligation, especially as Charlie mentioned, if you do have a permit, the police have a responsibility to keep the peace and to prevent you from being bullied or somehow coerced into giving up your rights to demonstrate and protest. And likewise, the counter-demonstrators have similar rights, and it's the police's job, which can be a very hard job, is to try to uphold all of those rights. Does it matter if other speech activities have taken place at the same location? It does, and largely in the sense of how the law and lawyers define public forum. If free speech activities frequently take place at a situation, then it's going to be very hard for the governmental agency or institution that controls that space to contend that you can't participate in something there. All right. Taking photographs, I think we've covered that in a lot of different ways. It's part of the idea of protest and demonstration. It's important before you participate in something like this that you know what your rights are. Don't just rely on one evening's pep talk from people like us. Look, use the resources. You use the good ones. We're giving you an idea of the best ones that there are out there where you can look for yourself and focus on the specific questions that you have. With that, we'd like to turn it over before the night gets too late and while we still have some time to have more questions about anything we've talked about tonight, including other topics that anybody thinks might be an interesting thing to have a further Know Your Rights event about.